He said it on a Thursday evening in early October. He said it in the kitchen of the house I had owned for 31 years. He said it while standing at my own kitchen counter, eating the dinner I had cooked, near the chair my late husband had sat in every evening, from 1993 until the week before he died. He said it because I had told him politely, and for the third time, that I would not be co-signing his business loan. He said it in the voice a 44-year-old man uses when he has run out of patience with a woman he has spent 3 years underestimating. And then he looked across the kitchen at me, and he waited for me to fold. By the following Tuesday morning, I had given him my answer. Not with tears, not with shouting, not by leaving. I answered him with a single document, signed at my own dining room table, notarized by a woman my husband had asked to be ready for exactly this kind of evening. Here is what actually happened. My name is Dorothy. I am 71 years old. My husband George died in 2021. We had been married for 46 years. He had been a civil engineer for 38 of them, a quiet, methodical man who had spent his career calculating how much weight a structure could bear before it failed, and who had spent the last year of his life doing that same careful math for a different kind of structure, the one that would protect me after he was gone. We bought the house in 1992, a 2-story colonial on a quiet street outside Cincinnati, Ohio. 4 bedrooms, a small study, a backyard where George planted a garden in 2003 and tended every spring, until the spring he couldn't anymore. We raised our daughter Karen in that house. She left for college in 2002 and never quite moved back, which sounds sadder than it is, because she built a life she loved, and I was glad to watch her build it. After George died, the house was in my name. George had insisted on that. In the summer before his death, in the careful voice he used when he was explaining the limits of a structure, he had said, "Dorothy, the house goes to you alone. Not to Karen, not to both of you together, to you, so that no one can make a single decision about it, but you." I had said, "George, Karen would never do anything with the house." And he had said, "Dorothy, it is not about what Karen would do, it is about what Karen's husband might one day suggest that Karen consider doing." I thought about that sentence for months without fully understanding it. I understood it now. Let me tell you about my son-in-law. His name was Ryan. He was 44. He had married Karen in 2015. In the early years, he was charming in the way that men who want something often are. Tall, well-dressed. The kind of easy confidence that reads, from a distance, like competence. From a closer distance, it read differently. Ryan had been starting businesses since he was 31. A landscaping company, a home remodeling service, a stretch selling supplements online, a commercial cleaning franchise that did well for about 18 months. None of them lasted. Not because Ryan was unintelligent, he wasn't. He was, in fact, very good at the beginning of things. The idea, the pitch, the early excitement. He was far less good at the middle. And the end. For nearly 3 years, Karen had been carrying their household. She worked as a nurse practitioner. Long hours. She never complained to me, at least, not in words. But I heard it in her voice on certain phone calls. The particular tiredness of a woman who is paying all the bills and pretending she doesn't mind. In March of 2023, Ryan started talking about a new business, a food truck. He had the concept, he said. He had the location. He had a friend who knew about the permits. What he needed, he said, was capital. The capital he needed was $80,000. He told me this at my dining room table over a Sunday dinner I had cooked. He looked right at me when he said the number. I looked back. I said, "That's a great deal of money, Ryan." He said, "It is. But the return is just as big, Dorothy. This is the one. I can feel it." I had heard "this is the one" before. Not about a food truck, but in that same bright register. The particular energy of a man who has fallen in love with his next beginning. I said, "Let me think about it." I was not, in truth, thinking about it as an investment. I was thinking about how to say no. I want to tell you about the 6 months between March and October. Because the Thursday in my kitchen did not come out of nowhere. It came out of 6 months of quiet, steady pressure, and 6 months of me resisting it, politely, one conversation at a time. In April, Ryan sent me a business plan, 12 pages, color printed, a logo, revenue charts. I read every page. Then I asked Karen, privately, whether she thought the numbers were realistic. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mom, Ryan really believes in this one." She had not answered my question. In May, Ryan suggested that instead of giving him the 80,000 in cash, I might take out a home equity line of credit against my house. He said, "The house has so much equity in it, Dorothy. That money is just sitting there in the walls. Put it to work." I said, very calmly, "Ryan, I will not be using my house as collateral for a business loan." He moved on to the next idea. In June, he asked me to co-sign a bank loan. He would borrow the 80,000. I would simply be the co-signer. Just a signature, Dorothy. You wouldn't even have to think about it. I said, "Ryan, when a person co-signs a loan, they are fully responsible for it if it isn't repaid. That is not just a signature, that is a legal obligation." He looked at Karen. Karen looked at her hands. In July, he tried a different door. Over dinner, he talked about how much the grandchildren Karen and Ryan had 2 boys, Tommy, 9, and Oliver, 6, would benefit from a successful family business. He said, "Dorothy, imagine what this could mean for the boys, a real family legacy, something we built together." I said, "Ryan, I am not a co-investor. I am Tommy and Oliver's grandmother. Those are two very different things." He let it go in July. He brought it back in August. And again in September. And then came the Thursday evening in early October. Karen was working a late shift that night. It was just Ryan, the 2 boys, and me. He arrived for dinner, and this time he brought the co-signing paperwork from the bank. He set it on my kitchen counter while I was at the stove. He said lightly, "I figured tonight might be a good time to just take care of this, Dorothy, while it's quiet." I turned from the stove. I looked at the papers on my counter. I said, "Ryan, I am not signing those papers. I have told you that several times, across several months. The answer hasn't changed." He was quiet for a moment. Then his face did the thing it does when the charm hasn't worked, and he is deciding what to try next. He said, "Dorothy, I really don't understand the problem. It's $80,000. You have this house. You have George's pension. You have the investment account. You are not struggling. You are sitting on resources that could genuinely help this family, and you won't. Why won't you help your own daughter's family?" I turned back to the stove. I said, "Ryan, the pasta is nearly ready. Would you call the boys in for dinner?" He did not call the boys. He said in a voice I had never heard from him before, but had been quietly expecting for some time, "Dorothy, if you won't help this family, then maybe you should leave. Maybe it's time to think about whether this arrangement still makes sense." I set down the wooden spoon. I turned around. I looked at him. He was standing at my kitchen counter. In my kitchen, in the house whose deed carried my name, and only my name, suggesting that I think about leaving it. I said, very quietly, "Ryan, whose name is on the deed to this house?" He said, "Dorothy, that's not—" I said, "Whose name is on the deed?" He said, "Yours, obviously yours. But Dorothy, we've been living here for 2 years, and—" I said, "Ryan, we are going to have dinner now, and we are not going to discuss this again tonight." He went quiet. The boys came to the table. We had dinner. Ryan ate 2 plates of pasta. The boys talked about school. I smiled and asked questions and passed the bread. And the whole time while Tommy explained the rules of a new game he'd learnt at recess, I was thinking about George. About the summer before he died. About what he had said about the deed. And I was remembering that George had not only put the deed in my name, He had also left something for me, with a lawyer. I want to stop here and ask you something honestly. If your son-in-law stood in your kitchen, the kitchen of your own home, the home you had lived in for 31 years, the home whose deed carried only your name, and told you that maybe you should be the one to leave, if you wouldn't co-sign his business loan, what would you have done? I think a lot of women would have cried. I think some would have called their daughter that very minute. I think a brave few would have done exactly what I did. I waited until the boys were asleep. Then I walked Ryan to the front door, the way I have walked every guest out of my house for 31 years. I told him to drive safely, and I closed the door behind him. I went back into the kitchen. I washed the dishes. I dried them. I put them away. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, and on a clean sheet of paper, I wrote down the exact words Ryan had said to me. If you won't help, maybe you should leave. I wrote it in my own hand. I dated it. I noted the time. Then I went upstairs to the bedroom I had slept in for 31 years, and I opened the drawer of George's nightstand, the one I had not changed since the week after he died, and I took out a small business card. The name on it was Mara Ellsworth, an attorney. George had given me that card in the summer of 2021. He had said, Dorothy, if Ryan ever says something that makes you feel like a guest in your own home, you call Mara. She has been expecting your call since June. I have already paid her retainer. I had kept that card in the nightstand for 2 years and 4 months, and the whole time I had been hoping I would never need it. I called Mara Ellsworth the next morning at 9. Mara Ellsworth was 56, and she had been a property and estate attorney in Cincinnati for 28 years. She had a steady, precise way of speaking on the phone that reminded me of George, which I had found comforting. In the 3 years I had been navigating the world without him. She answered on the second ring. She said, Dorothy Harmon, I've been waiting for your call. I said, Mara. He said the words. She said, tell me exactly. So I told her. The 6 months of pressure, the escalating proposals, the papers on the kitchen counter, the sentence at the stove. When I finished, she said, Dorothy, your husband left a folder with me in June of 2021. I'd like to read you the first line of the document inside it. I heard her open something. She read, to be activated the day Dorothy calls to report that Ryan has suggested, implied, or stated directly that she should consider leaving the house, transferring the house, borrowing against the house, or allowing any other name to be added to the deed. I said, he knew exactly what to look for. Mara said, George was very specific, Dorothy. He was an engineer. He didn't deal in vague terms. I said, what is in the folder? She said, 3 things. The first is a letter from George, to you. The second is a pre-drafted notice of occupancy terms, a formal document that establishes, in legal writing, the terms under which Ryan and Karen reside in your home. It is not an eviction notice. It is a clarification of legal occupancy. The third is an amendment to your will, which George drafted with me in June of 2021 that I believe you'll want to sign. I said, Mara, please come to my house. I want to do all 3. She said, I'll be there Monday morning at 10. Mara arrived at 10 o'clock on Monday. She brought a leather portfolio, and she brought a notary in a separate car. We sat at my dining room table, the same table where Ryan had first mentioned the food truck, the same table where he had spread out his 12-page business plan in April, the same table that had stood in my house since 1997. Mara set the folder down. She handed me the envelope first. George's handwriting was on the front. It said, Dorothy, in case I was right about Ryan. I broke the seal. I read, Dorothy, if you are reading this, then I was right about Ryan. I am sorry about that. I would honestly have preferred to be wrong. I want to tell you why I put the deed in your name alone. It was not because I didn't trust Karen. I trust Karen completely. I put the deed in your name alone because I had been watching Ryan since 2016. when he and Karen first got serious, and I noticed something about him that I never said to you at the time, because I did not want to change the way you saw him. What I noticed was this. Ryan does not really see people. He sees resources. He looks at a person, and before he has even said hello, he has measured what they have, and whether it might one day be useful to him. He does it quickly and smoothly, and most people never notice. I noticed, because I spent 38 years doing structural assessments. After that long, spotting the load-bearing element in a room is simply a reflex. He looked at you the way he looks at things he is planning to use. I didn't say it to you then. I am saying it now because if you are reading this letter, he has finally said the sentence I always expected him to say. In one form or another, he has suggested that you should be the one to leave your own home. Dorothy, the house is yours, the deed is yours. The 31 years of mortgage payments, the garden, the kitchen, the guest room where Karen slept until she was 18, all of it is yours. My name is on the foundation stone and in the deed office, and nowhere else. Ryan cannot remove you. He cannot borrow against it. He cannot use it as collateral. He cannot add his name to it without your signature on a paper you will never sign. Mara has the paperwork. The notice of occupancy will state, in plain legal language, that Ryan and Karen are guests in your home. Welcomed, loved guests, but guests, and that the terms of that arrangement can be changed by you at any time, for any reason. The will amendment reroutes the portion of your estate I had once left to Karen jointly into a direct trust for Tommy and Oliver instead. Karen still inherits her full share. But the part that would have passed through Karen into Ryan's household now goes straight to the boys, to each of them, at age 25. Dorothy, do not be afraid of these documents. They are not weapons. They are engineering. They are load-bearing walls. I love you. Tell the garden I'm sorry about the tomatoes this year. George. I set the letter down. I did not cry. Mara was watching me carefully. I said, Mara, the tomatoes were actually very good this year. She smiled. She said, Dorothy, are you ready to sign? I said, yes. We worked at the dining room table for 2 hours. The first document was the Notice of Occupancy Terms. Mara walked me through every line. It stated, in plain legal language, that Dorothy Ann Harmon was the sole owner of the property and that any other occupant, regardless of family relationship, lived there at the owner's discretion, subject to a 30-day written notice if the situation ever required a change. It was not an eviction notice. It was a clarification of reality. A reality that Ryan had somehow forgotten on a Thursday evening in early October. The second document was the will amendment. The share of my estate once designated for Karen's household jointly was redirected. Karen's own inheritance was untouched. But the assets that would have flowed through the joint arrangement, the investment account, and a portion of the home's eventual equity now flowed directly into a trust for Tommy and Oliver. Each boy would receive his share at 25. Ryan was not in the trust. Ryan was not a beneficiary. His name appeared nowhere in the amended documents, except in one small clause that prevented any future spouse of any of my beneficiaries from making a claim on the trust during that beneficiary's lifetime. George had thought of that too. The notary stamped each page. By noon on Monday, the occupancy terms were legal. The will amendment was signed. The trust was established. I made Mara a cup of coffee. We sat together for a few quiet minutes. She said, Dorothy, have you decided what you'll say to Karen? I said, I've been thinking about it since Thursday. She said, and? I said, I'm going to tell her the truth, gently, without asking her to choose. I am not trying to end her marriage. I am only making sure that her husband cannot end my security. Mara nodded. She said, George would approve. I said, George would call it a sound, structural decision. She smiled at that. She left at 12:30. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after she was gone. I called Karen that afternoon. She was on a break between shifts. She sounded tired in the way she had sounded tired for nearly 2 years. I said, "Karen, sweetheart, are you sitting down?" She said, "Mum, what happened?" I told her. About Thursday evening, about Ryan's proposals across 6 months, about the papers on the counter, about the sentence at the stove. I told her what I had signed on Monday morning. I told her about George's letter. When I finished, Karen was quiet for a long, long time. Then she said very softly, "Mom, he said that to you, in your own kitchen." I said, "He did, sweetheart." She said, "Mom, I—" She stopped. She started again. She said, "Mom, I have been covering for him for a long time now. I kept telling myself it was just how he talks when he's stressed. I kept telling myself the next business would be the one. I kept telling myself—" She stopped again. I said, "Karen, sweetheart, I am not asking you to do anything. I am not asking you to leave him. I am not asking you to choose between him and me. I am only telling you what happened in my home and what I have done about it. Your inheritance is protected. The boy's inheritance is protected. My house is protected. Everything else is between you and Ryan." She said, "Mom, the food truck, we can't pay for it ourselves. I don't know what he's going to do." I said, "Karen, that question what Ryan will do, now that he cannot use my money to fund his business, is a question between you and Ryan. I am here for you, anytime you want to talk, but I am not available to Ryan for any conversation about money. If he wants to discuss the legal documents, Mara Ellsworth's number is printed on the papers he'll receive by certified mail this week." Karen was quiet. Then she said, "Certified mail." I said, "Certified mail, sweetheart." She said, "Mom, Dad thought of all of this." I said, "He thought of most of it. I only had to add the October part." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Mom, I'm going to talk to Ryan tonight, before the mail comes." I said, "That's a wise instinct, sweetheart." She said, "Mom, I love you." I said, "I love you too, sweetheart. Now go rest before your next shift." We hung up. The certified mail arrived at Karen and Ryan's house on Wednesday. Ryan did not call me Wednesday. He did not call me Thursday. On Friday morning, I was in the backyard in George's garden, cutting back the last of the tomato vines, the way George had shown me back in 2003 when my phone rang. It was Ryan. I set down the garden shears. I answered. I said, "Good morning, Ryan." He said, "Dorothy." His voice was controlled in a way that suggested it was costing him something to keep it that way. "Dorothy, I received a legal document this week." I said, "Yes." He said, "Dorothy, I want to talk about the other night. In the kitchen, I want to apologize." I was frustrated, and I said something I didn't mean, and I'm sorry. I said, "Ryan, thank you for the apology." He said, "Dorothy, about the document." I said, "Ryan, the document is a legal clarification of the living arrangement. It changes nothing about your day-to-day life in the home. You and Karen and the boys are welcome here. It simply puts in writing what has always been true. The home is mine, and the terms of your residence here are mine to set." He said, "Dorothy, the part about the will." I said, "Ryan, the will is my own business. I have made changes that I believe protect my grandchildren's future. I am not going to discuss the specifics with you. If you have legal questions, Mara Ellsworth is available." A long pause. He said, "Dorothy, I think we need to talk, as a family, about the direction of things." I said, "Ryan, I'm happy to talk. And I will tell you the same thing I have told you for 6 months. I will not co-sign the loan. I will not borrow against the house. I will not add any name to the deed. Those 3 answers are not going to change in a family meeting. The conversation you need to have about the food truck is a conversation between you and a bank." Another pause. He said, "Yes." "Just that, yes." I said, Ryan, please tell Karen I'll have Sunday dinner ready at 6. I'm making the pot roast the boys like. I'd love to see everyone. He said, I'll tell her. And we hung up. I stood in George's garden for a while after the call ended. The late October morning was cool and clear. The tomato vines were dry and rust-coloured. I had already brought the last of the season's tomatoes inside. The garden was winding down, the way gardens do in Ohio in October, quietly, without drama, simply becoming something that would begin again in the spring. George had always loved this part of the season. He used to say the end of a garden was not the sad part. The sad part, he said, was leaving it to someone who didn't understand what it took to keep it growing. He had left it to me, and I knew exactly what it took. Sunday dinner was quiet. The boys had 2 helpings of pot roast. Tommy told me about a book he was reading. Oliver fell asleep on the couch before dessert. Ryan was polite. He helped clear the table. He thanked me for dinner. He did not mention the loan. He did not mention the letter. He did not mention the deed. After they had put the boys to bed, Karen came back downstairs alone. She sat at the kitchen table while I finished the dishes. She said, Mom, Ryan and I talked Thursday night. He admitted he'd been putting far more pressure on you than he'd told me about. The home equity idea. The co-signing. He never told me he brought papers to the house. I said, I know, sweetheart. She said, Mom, I've been working double shifts for 2 years to cover what the businesses never made. I knew it. I just kept telling myself it would get better. I said, Karen, does it feel like it's getting better? She was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at her hands. And then, slowly, the way a person finally says out loud the thing they have been refusing to say for 2 years, she said, No, Mom, it doesn't. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I came and sat down beside her at the kitchen table. I said, Karen, sweetheart, that is the most honest thing you have said to me in a very long time, and what you do with it is entirely yours to decide. I am not going to tell you what to do. I am only going to tell you this. Whatever you decide, your inheritance is protected. The boys' trust is established. And this house is mine. You will always have a place to come home to, and the boys will always have a grandmother who isn't going anywhere. She came around the table, and she put her arms around me, and she held on for a long time. I let her hold on. That night, I sat in George's reading chair, in the study, with the small notebook I had started keeping the morning after that Thursday in the kitchen, and I wrote one line. My son-in-law told me that if I wouldn't help, maybe I should leave. He forgot whose name was on the deed. And I learned, at 71, that the most loving thing my husband ever did for me was the Tuesday afternoon in June of 2021, when he sat in a lawyer's office, thought like the engineer he was, and quietly built me a load-bearing wall. Sometimes dignity does not arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives on a Monday morning, at a dining room table, with a notary and a leather portfolio, and the calm, steady handwriting of a man who knew, 3 years before the sentence was ever spoken, exactly what shape it would take. I closed the notebook. The house was quiet. Outside the window, George's garden was winding down for the winter. The deed was in my name. It had always been in my name. Ryan had simply forgotten. I had not.